Good morning. Welcome to another in our series of our weekly Meet the Experts Q&A sessions with Sintons Employment Team. My name's David Pritchard and I'm the Head of Marketing at Sintons. I know I say this every week and have done for the last 6 or 7 sessions, but thank you once again for all your positive comments, your questions that you keep sending in, and your engagement. Generally, we've been blown away with the amount of people that are engaging and watching these sessions each week, so thank you very much for that. As with previous weeks, the employment team will answer 3 questions, either COVID related or not, that you haven't quite got to the bottom of, or that your employees are persistently asking you. So our speakers today, I'll just move on, our Head of Employment Keith Land and Associate Angela Carver. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass you straight over to Angela for question 1 of 3. Angela, good morning and over to you.
Good morning, David, and good morning, everybody. David has been scaring us a little with the amount of you who've joined already this morning. I did used to like him, but there we go. It is wonderful that so many of you do tune in. This week has been crazy in relation to changes that have been occurring. Obviously, we can now go out and have half-price food Monday to Wednesdays. There's been stamp duty reductions. The gyms are opening, and Keith will be very happy that the swimming pools are back open as well. One thing that to bear in mind as an employer is that you can get a potentially £1,000 payment for every employee that you return until the end of January 2021. 2 things to note: the employee needs to be paid at least £520 a month, and they need to have been employed between November and the January. We've also had some bad news. Obviously, we've heard about John Lewis closing 8 stores and Boots losing 4,000 members of staff. So there has been some ups and there has been some downs. Now, one of the first questions, which is clearly going to be slightly COVID related, is whether or not an employer can use the money that is paid to the job retention scheme to pay notice payments for an employee who has been terminated. Now, this has caused quite a few concerns. The third Treasury guidance was published on the 26th of June, and it was dealing with the implementation of the flexible furlough scheme, which obviously started on the 1st of July. Now, paragraph 2.2 for the boffins who want to read it states, and I'm going to read from my notes for this one, an integral to the purpose of the job retention scheme is that the amounts paid to an employer pursuant to the job retention claim are used by the employer to continue the employment of employees in relation to whom the job retention claim is made. Now, the reading of this has caused much confusion, and even the Telegraph published an article on the 4th of July 2020. So it would appear that you can only claim under the job retention scheme if you're going to continue to employ that employee, but actually that's not what it's saying at all. What this means in that paragraph is that the money claimed under the job retention scheme must be used to continue to pay for employees. Because it would be surprising, quite frankly, if you can re-engage a former employee for the purpose of putting on the job retention scheme, but you can't claim for an employee that you're then looking to terminate. It would seem a little nonsensical to us. A couple of things to bear in mind, which I'm hoping everybody on this video link notes, is from August, you need to start paying obviously national insurance and pension contributions for your furloughed employees, and then 10% of pay contribution in September, 20% in October. So overall, yes, you can use the job retention scheme funds to pay for notice payments, but things you can't use them for are redundancy payments. And obviously redundancy will be calculated on pre-furlough pay. And you also can't use them to pay out a pile-on. That's a payment in lieu of notice clause. So if you were to terminate your employee and say, we'll pay you your notice, you have to stump up the bill for that one. You can't use the job retention scheme. But we are fine with you using the job retention scheme funds to pay for notice. And that, I think, answers question 1. Keith, any comments at all?
None whatsoever. To be perfectly honest with you, I was amazed how to the point it was, and you're not going on forever. But you know, that's you know, that's the pot calling the kettle black, isn't it? Really.
Amazed.
Right, well, I suppose that hands over to me then, doesn't it? And I'll crack on with question 2. Yes, I am thrilled about the pools, I must admit. Not that I'm a swimmer myself. For those of you who don't know, I have 3 kids who all swim about 12 hours a week, who are currently a bit like caged animals, and they're having to spend their time in the house with me, so they want to get out and I want to get them out. So actually from the end of this month I'll be thrilled, albeit I'm really looking forward to sitting back by a pool for about 30 hours a week, but never mind. Amending contracts of employment for employees returning from furlough. Whoa, where to start on this one? We put this in because clients have been asking about it, funnily enough, and we thought it's useful to cover, given the recovery or the partial recovery, because it's possibly somewhere where a lot of employers are going to have to go. We immediately think that you've got to dive into changing contracts of employment by consent, and that's probably the less contentious part of it, but that's not your starting point. Your starting point is to go back to your contracts of employment. A lot of contracts, if they've been well drafted, have an express right to vary hours subject to the needs of the business, change remuneration subject to the needs of the business, and therefore you may have an express right to change contracts, to change hours, and to consequently change pay. Now, that doesn't mean that you've got an express right to do what, forgive my vernacular, but what the hell you want. When you're relying on contractual clauses, they've got to be expressed, they've got to cover the exact eventuality that you are going to implement. What it means is that you have a discretion, and as an employer, you have a discretion to change those hours. What does that mean when you have a discretion? The best way I can describe it is, because if I lapse off into the legal stuff, it talks about not being capricious, and I'd have to pick up a dictionary to work out what that means. In effect, you've got to exercise that discretion in a fair manner. That doesn't mean you have to go as far as it being reasonable, but in a sense, you've got a discretion. You've got to implement it for the purposes in which it was intended. Let me give you an example. Earlier this year, I was contacted by a client that works in the travel sector. This was back in February, before we had lockdown, and they could see that the travel was dropping off. And they came to us and said, look, we can see that travel's falling away because of the pandemic and what's happening. People aren't wanting to travel. What do we do? We need to reduce hours and manage cash. But actually, what generally happens is we see an explosion later in the year, where people are sick of being stuck under an Icelandic ash cloud and things like that. And when this passes, people tend to spend their cash and buy holidays, and then woof, will take off again. So we need the people, we don't want to lose them. And they were immediately going to, well, actually, they were also saying, well, we can't wait 3 months to do a collective consultation. So what do we do to cut hours? What can we do? Do we just do it and take the risk? And I said, well, have you looked at your contracts? We looked at the contracts, and they had a clause specifically dealing with an increase in hours, and then one specifically dealing with an alternative change in hours to meet the needs of the business. And the way these clauses are looked at is you've got to look at what the contract was intended to do when it was drafted. And the fact that there is a clause in there that says we can increase hours and pay, and then there's an entirely separate clause that says actually we can amend the hours and thus pay to meet the needs of the business from time to time, meant that that secondary clause, because there was one specifically dealing with an increase in hours, had to be looking at a decrease in hours. And so we advised them that they could go ahead and implement that clause, so long as they had good reasons for doing it, which they did. So look at those clauses. You might have greater flexibility in the contract. It's a very difficult area because, as I said, just because you have a clause that says you can change hours, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can change pay. Those clauses have to be really well drafted to cover both hours and pay before you can rely on them. You also, when you're exercising those kind of clauses, have to have regard to the implied duty of trust and confidence. An employer can't do anything that will undermine the contract and allow people to resign and claim constructive dismissal. What the law says in that sense is, yes, you have a discretion, you're exercising it, but again, you've got to do so with regard to the implied duty. And if, for example, you're going to chop somebody's pay by 20, 30, 40%, that is probably going to be viewed as a breach of the implied duty, even though you have a power in the contract to reduce hours and reduce pay. So be wary of that and bear it in mind. If you can use the contract, I would say use the contract, because it's the least, it's aggressive, but actually you're working within the grounds of the contract that you originally implemented. If you don't have that, your next step is to move to consent. Okay, you can change contracts to your heart's content, as long as you get the individual's consent to do so. And in the current climate, employees can see that there has been a massive cash hit for people, and if you engage with your workforce, you may be able to bring in a number of different changes for different people, different shift patterns, different ways of working, which actually allows you to manage cash, give people jobs, and keep people in jobs, because some job is better than no job and mass redundancies. So again, you'd be surprised that engaging with workforces will move you forward. And again, if you don't have the express power, it's engaging with the workforce and getting consent. And if you get consent, and at the start of all these exercises, before we had the furlough scheme, we went through a number of exercises with our colleagues, and Angela did one specifically where with a client who runs hotels to scale back their operations hugely, but keep everyone effectively in a job. If then you can't get consent, where do you go next? Well, actually, you're into an area, you either make compulsory redundancies, and that's a bigger topic, or you force unilateral changes to hours and potentially pay. And that is by making a unilateral variation to contract. Oddly enough, in this area, if you are forcing a unilateral change to contract, where you're saying, well, actually, we need to reduce cash, and therefore we need to reduce hours and things like that, and we're going to say, actually, people are going to work 10% less, you might be able to implement that kind of change unilaterally. The one word of caution in this area is if you are doing that and it impacts 20 or more employees, there is a case called MAN-Truck, M-A-N-N, versus the GMB union, where the GMB union said, well, actually, if you're forcing changes to terms and conditions of employment and it impacts 20 or more people, it fulfills the definition of the mass redundancy legislation, even though you are not proposing to dismiss anybody as redundant. And that went before either the Court of Appeal or even the House of Lords, and they said, yep, the GMB union is correct. So bear in mind that you may trigger the mass redundancy legislation if you are going to make unilateral changes to terms and conditions of employment, which means a 30 or 45-day period of consultation. The reason is that the definition of redundancy for the mass redundancy legislation is it's a dismissal which is not connected to the individual concerned. And so in this instance, what the employer was proposing to do was it's going to engage with the workforce to try and get consent to bring about the changes of terms and conditions. If employees wouldn't consent, it then says, well, actually what we will do is we will dismiss you and re-engage you on the new terms. And so there were dismissals in a sense, albeit that the employer intended to take everyone back on the revised terms and conditions. And so there was no overall job losses, but there were dismissals involved. And because they were not related to the individuals concerned, because it was a general change to terms and conditions, it triggered the mass redundancy legislation, thus requiring this period of collective consultation in advance. The short answer, really, there's a lot to this. If you are forced into this area, I think you do need to take some serious advice, because there are, particularly if you have 20 or more employees impacted, because there are some huge commercial ramifications. If you get the legislation on failure to inform and consult on a mass redundancy wrong, you could get hit with a liability which is a quarter of your annual wage bill. I know that sounds scary, but that's what it is. It's a punitive sanction to stop people flouting the legislation. You need advice on these areas, but what is a very useful tool in the current climate is the express clauses and consent. People know that there is an economic downturn, people know there is going to be hardship, and you'll be surprised at what they will agree to in the current climate. Having accused Angela of going on too long at the front end, I have made like my hair, which has gone on far too long, and I need a haircut, so I'm going to pass back to Angela, who's going to kick off on the last question. But first, I suppose she might have some thoughts on what I've just said.
Hi, Keith. No, I think you've covered it quite well. I'm just surprised you remember a case from 20 years ago. Court of Appeal, that one as well, just for the record. And you know that because I googled it whilst you were doing your segment. I think in relation to long hair, I was just recommending that I'm starting to look a little bit like Rapunzel as well. So I think we're all very desperate for the hairdressers. The last topic that I was going to look at was a little bit more from a practical viewpoint for tribunals. Now, I had a preliminary hearing before the Newcastle Tribunal on Tuesday, and it was suggested that we're not looking to have any in-person hearings before December 2020 at the earliest. Now, that's not ideal for us. Keith and I spend a lot of time in the Employment Tribunal, and there's a lot to be said about having them in person. And I think most people will be in that situation, apart from perhaps the unrepresented claimant who doesn't want to face their former employer, for example. So what tends to be happening now is telephone hearings. So a claim gets submitted against you, you put your defence in. If it's an unfair dismissal, you'll usually proceed straight to a hearing. If it's a whistleblowing or discrimination type hearing, you will have what we call a preliminary hearing in the intervening period. Now, these are all held on the telephone now. For representatives, it's not an uncommon occurrence. We would do these quite frequently. They save a lot of cost and time, so it's much more beneficial for our clients. They're now just undertaken through a system called BT Meet Me, where the judge records them, and there's no issues. Everything's just continued business as normal. The concern is now when we get to a final hearing. Now, these are all held remotely via video link. If you are in an employment tribunal situation, you'll either find yourself in front of a judge sitting alone or a panel of 3. That will be a judge and a member on either side. Now, the member is, I say this spiel to clients every week, so it just rolls off my tongue. The members are, one is from an employer perspective, one from an employee. One's usually small business owner, etc. in the local area. One's usually former trade union rep, just to give balance to a panel. Now, a panel of 3 comes when you have things like discrimination or whistleblowing claims. And to be honest, with the 2-year jurisdiction to claim unfair dismissal, most cases do come with one of those caveats. So what you'll find is you're going to have a remote hearing with a number of people on it to start with. And what the tribunal said to me on Tuesday was, unless you've got a pretty good reason not to, your hearing will be held remotely. So if you've got a hearing between now and December, you can almost guarantee it's going to be virtual. So ways I can think it would not be held virtually: if you've got poor Wi-Fi, you've got a litigant in person who needs specific guidance, if there are potentially disability type issues, and language barriers. If not, what you'll find is your hearings held by what we call the cloud video platform. You'll hear it get called CVP, and that's been specifically developed by the Ministry of Justice to hold and platform hearings. And so far it seems to be doing okay. What you'll tend to find is in the week leading up to a hearing, you'll be invited to take part in a test with the clerk. So that's not with the judge, it's just a clerk of the court. And they'll just make sure your connection's sufficient and that you can proceed with the hearing. Sorry, it's my pink bottle coming in through the background. If you've got witnesses who are going to be in different areas, they will each need to undergo a test. So it's just making sure you're ready and willing to do that. If your test goes fine, you'll have your final hearing. Now, what would usually happen at a final hearing is you would walk into your tribunal room. It's a lot more informal than people tend to think. You would have a slightly raised bench with the judge and the 2 members. There'd be 2 small tables to either side of the bench, and there'd be a long bench in front where representatives would sit. When we have the virtual hearing, it will just depend how it operates. At Sintons, what we're doing is we're utilising the fact that we've got quite a large building with a lot of meeting rooms. And so we're having all of our witnesses into the building. So we will reserve rooms for the witness table, we'll reserve a room for everybody to get together. And for a hearing we have in 3 weeks, we're also reserving rooms for the claimant, just to ensure that if there are any potential issues with Wi-Fi, we've got a great IT department who can come and fix it all. I can foresee quite a few issues, and I'm sure Keith will have some opinions on this as well. With a remote hearing, I can see him nodding in the corner of my screen. First thing to bear in mind, a remote hearing is still a court hearing, so you need to mind your P's and Q's and dress appropriately. You need to abide by the rules of the court. Secondly, if technology works, it's great. If it doesn't, you literally want to bang your head off the wall. That's the other thing there. I can see issues like your Wi-Fi is not working, your connectivity goes, you're getting booted off the system. And then if you're working from home, you've got your children running in, so there's no privacy. You've got Amazon, if it's my house, coming in doing deliveries at least every day. You've got the postman. And then one of the concerns that I have is things like tampering. So ordinarily, a witness would go onto the witness table with a clean bundle, a clean witness statement. There'd be no notes. It's just that clean bundle and the truth, hopefully. If you're virtual and people can't see, you could have your notes everywhere. You could have, a partner, a former colleague, a friend prompting you in the distance, and that could cause some concerns. And that's why at Sintons we're allowing the claimants as well to come into the premises. It alleviates that. It potentially limits that risk of appeal, that the hearing has not potentially been undertaken fairly. And one key thing to bear in mind is you can't record these hearings. If you do record them, there could be legal practicalities for you under the Contempt of Court Act, something clearly you would want to avoid. So my view, always better to cross-examine in person, but practically to avoid delays. This looks like the future, we have to embrace it, and it's just to be prepared. And I'll pass over to Keith now for his opinions.
I think I mean, that was great, Angela. I agree with you that this is the position that we're in, and I don't think we clearly don't have a choice. We're all going to have to embrace it and get on with it. You were talking about hearings between now and December. I was obviously on a call with Glasgow tribunals and have been on calls with Manchester. They were looking at listing April 2021 and beyond, towards the back end of 2021. Glasgow is a bit less busy, but it's still 2021 before they're putting hearings in. And there's going to be a colossal backlog. So the tribunals have to do something to move hearings through the system. Whether we like it or not, there's going to be redundancies and dismissals, and the tribunal lists are just going to get busier and busier and busier. And there is a lot to be said to get those hearings done and dusted, so memories don't fade. I know we would all prefer to do them in person, but actually you're probably better having a reasonably fresh understanding of the facts rather than having a hearing in 2 years' time when your management team has all moved on. I think there are practical difficulties. We all have done nothing but video conferencing for the last 3 months, and everyone has to be really respectful of each other's views, but it's impossible to see when somebody is going to speak. We talk over the top of one another from time to time. Tribunal hearings don't move fast at the best of times, but it is very much an adversarial environment. And if you can all hear me clanking pans, it's not me, it's my daughter who's in the kitchen, who's currently going to bake a cake. But there you go, there's an example of exactly what Angela has been talking about. I'll put her in the cake afterwards. Anyway, so I think the practicalities of things, and if you've been to the tribunal before, it is an adversarial process where people do jump in, they do wait for an answer, and they do demand an answer. And some of your employment tribunal chair people can be pretty gruff individuals, and they don't like people jumping in and talking across the top of them and things like that. And so managing that entire process is going to be really very difficult, I think, particularly if it is a long-term hearing. And joking aside, I'm sat with my earphones in. David's got nice sort of footballer headphones on. but these knack after about half an hour. And so, you know, we're all going to have to be set up for sitting with these things in our lug holes for days on end. I think it will increase the length of hearings, which brings with it an increasing cost to you people out there. But again, you've got to balance up, A, they're going to happen, and B, would you rather have the thing done and dusted and moved off your desk, whether it's a good result or it's a bad result at the end of the day? I don't think there's anything more to add than that, other than to say hopefully we'll all get back to normal soon, and remote tribunals will be limited, because being there in person is best. I think that's enough for me, David. I'm just going to pass across to you to wind up, if that's okay, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks both. So just a reminder, we continue to produce and deliver useful and relevant content, articles, blogs, podcasts, videos, Q&A sessions like these, all of which can be found on our website at www.sintons.co.uk should you wish to take a look. And this includes all episodes of the Q&A sessions. You can also follow the employment team on Twitter at SintonsHR. Just moving the slide on. If you would like to discuss anything the guys have raised today further, please don't hesitate to get in touch with them. Details are on the screen. Full details obviously are on the website as well. So if it's an employment inquiry, if it's any legal inquiry, please do not hesitate to get in touch. Our next session will be a week today on Teams at 10 AM, and I'll send the link round as usual after the weekend. So from Keith, Angela and myself, thank you very much for listening once again this morning. Stay safe everyone, and have a great weekend. The sun looks like it's coming out here in Newcastle, so hopefully we have a fabulous weekend. Take care everyone. Thank you.